The Vanishing Hitchhiker. You know that feeling when you are driving entirely alone in the dead of night? The radio dial turns to static, the headlights barely cut through the suffocating darkness, and the rhythmic thumping of the tires lulls you into a trance. Then, for a split second, your headlights wash over something standing on the shoulder of the road. Your heart skips a beat. You blink. You look in the rearview mirror, and there is nothing there. You tell yourself it was just a shadow, just a trick of the exhausted mind. But what if it wasn't? What if it was waiting for you? And what if, God forbid, you actually pulled over? Tonight, we are taking a ride down a forgotten stretch of highway where the passengers you pick up never truly make it home. Turn your headlights on, lock your doors, and turn the volume up. Welcome to American Haunted Tales. There is a specific kind of silence that only exists inside a moving car at 3 a.m. It is a heavy, pressurized silence, insulated by glass and steel, entirely separated from the world outside. The only reality is the dashboard's faint, ghostly green glow and the hypnotic, repetitive flash of the dashed white lines slipping under the hood. My name is David, and 2 years ago, I was driving a route I had driven 100 times before. I was making a long-haul run from Chicago down to a small, rural county in southern Illinois. It was late November, the kind of deep, bitter autumn where the air feels like it has teeth. A massive storm front had moved in around midnight. It wasn't snow, but a relentless, freezing rain that came down in sheets, hammering against the roof of my sedan like handfuls of gravel. The windshield wipers were fighting a losing battle, squeaking frantically back and forth, smearing the water across the glass and distorting the world outside into a blurred, watery nightmare. I had been driving for 8 straight hours. My eyes burned, a feeling like they were full of sand. I was hopped up on cheap gas station coffee and the stale, recycled heat blasting from the vents, trying desperately to keep my eyelids from drooping. I had turned off the interstate hours ago to take a shortcut down County Road 11, a 2-lane strip of blacktop that cuts through miles of dense, overgrown forest and empty farmland. There are no streetlights out there. There are no gas stations. There is just the road, the trees, and the dark. The radio had died an hour ago. Every station I tried to tune into was swallowed by a thick, hissing wall of static. The isolation was absolute. It felt as though I was the last living person on Earth, navigating a submarine through the bottom of a pitch-black ocean. I rounded a sharp, sweeping curve, the tires hydroplaning slightly on the slick asphalt. My stomach dropped as the steering wheel went light in my hands for a fraction of a second before the rubber found traction again, and I cursed under my breath, easing off the accelerator. As the headlights swept across the right shoulder of the road, illuminating the tall, dead grass and the edge of the tree line, I saw it. A figure, standing perfectly still in the torrential rain. I slammed on the brakes instinctively. The anti-lock brakes engaged, pulsing violently under my foot as the car fishtailed, the tires screaming against the wet road. I wrestled the wheel, from bringing the vehicle to a shuddering halt on the muddy shoulder, the hazard lights clicking loudly in the quiet cabin. I sat there for a moment, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I peered through the rain-streaked windshield. About 50 yards back, illuminated by the harsh red glow of my taillights, was a person. It was a young woman. She was standing dangerously close to the white line, entirely exposed to the freezing downpour. She had no umbrella. She wasn't wearing a coat. She was dressed in a pale, thin dress that clung to her small frame, soaked entirely through. Her dark hair was plastered flat against her face and shoulders. She didn't wave her arms. She didn't shout. She just stood there, her head tilted slightly downward, a solitary, fragile silhouette in the middle of a brutal storm. Every survival instinct I had, every true crime podcast I had ever listened to, screamed at me to put the car in drive and get the hell out of there. You don't pick up strangers in the middle of the night. You just don't. But looking at her, shivering violently in the freezing rain, my conscience overrode my paranoia. She was going to freeze to death out here. Hypothermia would take her in less than an hour in these temperatures. I put the car in reverse and slowly backed up the shoulder, the gravel crunching loudly under the tires. I stopped right next to her and leaned over, rolling down the passenger side window. The frigid wind and rain immediately blasted into the warm cabin, carrying the sharp metallic smell of wet asphalt and dead leaves. "Hey!" I shouted over the roar of the storm. "Are you okay? You need a ride?" She didn't react immediately. She slowly turned her head toward the open window. Even in the dim light, she looked incredibly pale, almost luminous against the dark backdrop of the forest. Her lips were a faint shade of blue. "Please," she said. Her voice was incredibly soft, barely carrying over the sound of the rain. It was a delicate, trembling whisper. "I need to get home. I'm so cold." "Get in," I said quickly, unlocking the door. "Hurry! Get out of the rain!" She reached out with a trembling hand, opened the heavy door, and slid into the passenger seat. She pulled the door shut, sealing us back inside the quiet, insulated cabin. The moment she sat down, the temperature inside the car plummeted. It wasn't just the cold air she had let in. It felt as though the heat radiating from the vents was being swallowed entirely. She sat perfectly rigid, her hands clutched tightly in her lap. Water dripped from her hair, pooling on the rubber floor mat. I noticed then that her dress looked incredibly old-fashioned. A vintage cut, perhaps from the 60s or 70s, made of a fabric that looked completely unsuitable for autumn weather. "Jesus, you're freezing," I said, reaching into the back seat and grabbing my heavy wool winter coat. I draped it over her trembling shoulders. "Put this on. Turn the vents toward you. What are you doing out here in the middle of nowhere without a jacket?" She pulled the thick wool coat tightly around herself, her pale fingers gripping the collar. She didn't look at me. She just stared straight ahead through the windshield, watching the rain hammer against the glass. "I was at a dance," she whispered, her voice still carrying that strange, distant echo. "There was an argument. I decided to walk. It wasn't raining when I left." "A dance?" I asked, frowning slightly. There was nothing out here for 20 miles in either direction. No towns, no halls, no schools. "Where are you headed? I can take you home." 1428 Elmwood Drive, she said immediately, as if she had rehearsed the address 1,000 times. "It's about 10 miles straight up this road, then a left at the old crossroads." I nodded, putting the car back into drive and pulling cautiously onto the wet asphalt. "All right, Elmwood Drive. I'm David, by the way." "I'm Mary," she replied, her voice barely a breath. I tried to make small talk as we drove, hoping to ease the tension that had flooded the small cabin. The silence was beginning to feel heavy, almost oppressive. "So, Elmwood Drive," I said, keeping my eyes on the road. "Do you live there with your parents?" "My mother," Mary said softly. "She's waiting for me. She always waits up when I go out. She worries." "Well, she's going to be glad you got a ride," I offered, turning the heater up to its maximum setting. The fan roared loudly, blasting hot air into the car, but Mary didn't seem to warm up. In fact, Sitting next to her felt like sitting next to an open refrigerator. A deep, radiating chill seemed to seep from her skin, cutting right through the heavy wool of my coat. I glanced over at her. She was incredibly still. She wasn't shivering anymore, which, looking back, should have been the first major red flag. Hypothermia makes you shake violently. When you stop shaking, it means your core temperature is dropping to fatal levels. But she just sat there, staring blankly into the dark, her chest barely moving. And then I noticed the smell. It wasn't a foul odor. It was distinct. It smelled like dried lavender, old dust, and the sharp metallic tang of copper. It was the scent of a room that had been sealed shut for decades. It filled the cabin, overriding the smell of my coffee and the stale heat from the vents. "Are you warming up at all?" I asked, my voice betraying a hint of nervousness. She slowly turned her head to look at me. Her eyes were dark, massive, and entirely hollow. There was a profound, overwhelming sadness in them that made my chest physically ache. It was a look of pure, unadulterated grief. "The cold never really goes away," she whispered. I swallowed hard, while gripping the steering wheel tighter. My knuckles were turning white. The rational part of my brain told me she was just in shock. She was a young girl who had been caught in a freezing storm. Of course, she was acting strangely. We drove in complete silence for the next 10 minutes. The only sound was the relentless thumping of the wipers and the hum of the engine. The road stretched out before us, an endless black ribbon cutting through the dead trees. I watched the odometer tick over, counting down the miles until the crossroads. I wanted this ride to be over. The tension in the car was becoming unbearable. The air felt thick, charged with a strange, static electricity that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Finally, my headlights caught the faded, rusted reflective paint of a street sign leaning precariously on the shoulder. Elmwood Drive. "Here it is," I said, feeling a massive wave of relief wash over me. I flicked my turn signal on, the rhythmic clicking sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet car. I took the left turn slowly, the tires slipping slightly in the mud. Elmwood Drive wasn't paved. It was a narrow, deeply rutted dirt road, heavily overgrown with massive oak trees whose branches formed a suffocating canopy overhead. The rain was blocked by the thick branches, leaving the road in almost total darkness. The headlights illuminated nothing but tree trunks and deep puddles. "How far down?" I asked, leaning forward to peer through the smeared glass. "At the very end," Mary whispered. She hadn't moved an inch. She was still staring straight ahead. I drove carefully, navigating the massive potholes that threatened to tear the suspension out of my car. The road seemed to stretch on forever, winding deeper and deeper into the forest. The isolation here was profound. My cell phone had lost its signal completely. If my car broke down here, we were completely cut off from the world. Finally, the trees parted, revealing a small, circular clearing. At the center of the clearing stood a house. It was a large, 2-story farmhouse, completely dark. There were no porch lights on. There were no lights glowing in the windows. It looked abandoned. The paint was peeling, and the front yard was overgrown with tall, dead weeds. I put the car in park and kept the engine running, the headlights illuminating the rotting wood of the front steps. "Are you sure this is it?" I asked, feeling a cold knot form in the pit of my stomach. "It looks completely dark. You sure your mom is home?" There was no answer. "Mary?" I asked, reaching over to tap her shoulder. We're here. I turned my head to look at her. The passenger seat was empty. There was no one there. I blinked, my brain entirely unable to process the image in front of me. I reached my hand out, my fingers brushing against the damp upholstery. The seat was cold. It was soaking wet. A small puddle of rainwater had collected in the heavy rubber floor mat. But Mary was gone. "Mary?" I said loudly, my voice cracking in the quiet cabin. I threw myself around, frantically checking the back seat. Empty. I looked out the passenger window into the dark woods, expecting to see her running toward the house. Nothing. Just the rain falling through the beams of my headlights. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded my chest. Had she opened the door while I was focused on the potholes? No, it was impossible. The doors automatically lock when the car is in drive. Furthermore, the dome light hadn't come on. I would have heard the heavy door open. I would have felt the blast of freezing rain. She had been sitting right next to me less than 10 seconds ago. And then I realized something else. My heavy wool winter coat, the one I had draped over her shivering shoulders, was gone too. I sat there with the engine idling, my breathing ragged and fast. The smell of dried lavender and copper was still heavy in the air, but it was fading, replaced by the sterile smell of the car's heater. I couldn't just drive away. If she had somehow slipped out, she was out there in the freezing dark. I shoved the car into park, grabbed my flashlight, and pushed my door open. The storm hit me instantly, the icy rain soaking through my shirt in seconds. I slammed the door shut and swept the beam of my flashlight across the overgrown yard. "Mary!" I yelled, the wind swallowing my voice almost immediately. I ran toward the dark house, my boots sinking deep into the thick, freezing mud. The porch steps groaned loudly under my weight, the wood soft with rot. There was no doorbell, just a heavy, rusted iron knocker shaped like a wreath. I grabbed it and slammed it against the door 3 times. The sound echoed loudly, sounding like gunshots in the quiet clearing. I waited, shivering violently, the water dripping from my nose and chin. I raised the knocker to slam it again, but before the iron struck the wood, a dim yellow light flickered on behind the frosted glass of the door. I heard the heavy scrape of a deadbolt sliding back. The door creaked open, just a few inches, held shut by a thick brass chain. An older woman peered out at me. Her face was deeply lined, framed by thin gray hair. She was wearing a thick quilted robe, her eyes heavy with sleep, but there was no fear in her expression. There was only a profound, bottomless exhaustion. "I'm sorry," I stammered, my teeth chattering. "I'm so sorry to wake you. I'm looking for Mary. I gave her a ride, but she..." The woman closed her eyes. She didn't look surprised. She didn't ask who I was. She just let out a long, shuddering sigh, a breath that seemed to carry the weight of decades. "She's not here," the woman said. Her voice was incredibly soft, bearing a striking, terrifying resemblance to the girl who had been sitting in my car. "She has to be," I insisted, wiping the freezing rain from my eyes. "I just drove her up Elmwood Drive. She told me this was her house. She said her mother was waiting up for her. Look, she was freezing. She left my car, and I just need to make sure she got inside safely." The older woman reached up with a trembling hand and unlatched the brass chain. She opened the door wider, the warm, yellow light from the hallway spilling out onto the porch. She looked at me, taking in my soaked clothes and my wide, panicked eyes. "You picked her up on County Road 11?" the woman said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. "Right near the sharp curve by the old iron bridge. I froze. Yes, how did you know that? She was wearing a pale dress. She told you she left a dance. She told you she was cold. The woman's eyes filled with tears, but they didn't fall. She had clearly cried all the tears she had left a very long time ago. Where is she? I whispered, a feeling of absolute paralyzing dread washing over me. She isn't here, sweetheart, the woman said gently. Mary is dead. She died in a car crash on that exact curve. The car lost control in the rain. She was trying to walk home. I shook my head, my mind rejecting the words. No, that's impossible. I just spoke to her. She was in my car. She was shivering. I gave her my coat. I smelled her. Lavender and copper. The woman nodded slowly. Blood and funeral flowers. That's what they laid her to rest in. You aren't the first person to come to this door in the middle of the night, son. You won't be the last. Every few years, when the November storms roll in, she tries to find her way back. She just wants to come home. My legs felt like they were made of lead. The porch seemed to tilt beneath me. When? I managed to choke out. When did she die? 1974. The woman whispered. She gently closed the door. I heard the deadbolt slide back into place, followed by the heavy clink of the brass chain. The yellow light clicked off, plunging the porch back into total darkness. I don't remember walking back to my car. I don't remember putting it in drive or navigating the rutted, muddy path of Elmwood Drive back to the main highway. My mind had completely detached from my body. I drove to the nearest town, found a brightly lit 24-hour diner, and sat in a booth drinking black coffee until the sun finally breached the horizon, painting the storm clouds in bruised shades of purple and gray. I tried to tell myself it was a hallucination, a product of sleep deprivation, highway hypnosis, and an overactive imagination. I tried to convince myself that the puddle of water on my passenger floor mat was just from a leak in the weather stripping. But there was one piece of physical reality that I couldn't explain away. Well, my heavy wool coat was missing. When the local library opened at 9 o'clock, I was the first person through the doors. I asked the librarian for the microfiche archives of the county newspaper from November 1974. It took me less than 20 minutes to find it. The headline was small, buried on the third page. Local teen perishes in tragic storm. There was a black and white photograph. It was Mary. The exact same massive, sad eyes. The exact same dark hair. The article stated she had been walking home from a high school dance after an argument with her boyfriend. She was struck by a hit-and-run driver on the sharp curve of County Road 11 and left to die in the freezing rain. The article ended with the location of her burial. The Oak Hills Cemetery, just 3 miles outside of town. I didn't want to go. Every instinct in my body told me to get back on the interstate and drive back to Chicago. But I had to know. I had to see it with my own eyes to prove to myself that I hadn't lost my mind. The cemetery was quiet, the wet grass glistening in the pale morning sun. I walked down the rows of weathered granite and marble, reading the names, listening to the crunch of wet leaves beneath my boots. Finally, near the back of the property, beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient weeping willow, I found it. A simple, flat headstone. Mary Elizabeth Vance, 1956 to 1974. Gone but not forgotten. And there, resting perfectly over the cold, wet granite of the headstone, was my heavy wool winter coat. It was neatly folded. The fabric was soaked through with the previous night's rain. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, the reality of the universe fracturing around me. I didn't touch the coat. I didn't take it back. I left it there, a meager offering to a girl who was destined to spend eternity shivering in the dark. I never drove down County Road 11 again. If my routes take me anywhere near that county, I add 50 miles to my trip just to stay on the brightly lit interstate, because I know what waits out there in the dark. I know that some people never make it to their destination, and I know that sometimes, if you pull over on a lonely stretch of highway, the passenger you pick up might not belong to this world at all. If you enjoyed this terrifying ride down County Road 11, make sure to hit that notification bell so you never miss a trip into the unknown. We have many more chilling urban legends and true ghost stories from the dark heart of America coming soon. Don't forget to subscribe to American Haunted Tales to support the channel and keep the campfire burning. Every subscription helps us bring these forgotten spirits back to life. You have been listening to American Haunted Tales. Lock your doors, stay in the light, and whatever you do, don't stop for strangers in the rain.
Thank you for watching.